Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for rejoining us after the lunch break. We've got a very, I think, intellectually rich afternoon planned for the remainder of the day. And kicking us off for the afternoon is Robert Zoellick, who has, as I'm sure all of you well know, served in a series of distinguished positions across the United States government, as well as international organizations, as president of the World Bank, as Deputy Secretary of State, as U.S. Trade Representative. So has thought about these issues both from the U.S. context, but also from the context of other countries as well, practicing industrial policy. Bob is going to give us about a half an hour of remarks on the topic, and then we'll have 10 or so minutes for questions after that. So with that, Bob, the floor is yours.
Well, first, thanks for the opportunity to be here with you, Chris. I'm a great admirer of your book. And I'm glad to see you're edging into the policy world, because when Chris first wrote his book, I asked a lot of questions on the policy side, and he said, well, as a historian, I'm just sort of writing the record. And I'm delighted to be here with my fellow contrarian, Larry Summers. It's one of the benefits of being older in life. You get to have a slightly different state of disagreement with people. But of course, we got the post-lunch challenge. I'm going to try to add a slightly different perspective to the one that you've heard this morning. I know, and I was able to listen to most of the panels about, some of the leading practitioners and proponents and certainly students of industrial policy. And throughout, I think you really, for the purposes of further work, refine sort of the techno-economic considerations. But since this is after lunch, I'd like to step back and recall some muffled drums from the march of history, and maybe even a cannonball or two about executive power in the US constitutional system. So I have a challenge. I always love history, and I'm never sure how much people in audiences know, but industrial policies are clearly not new things. The past proponents were motivated by fears about the domestic economy, anxieties about international competition, particularly from planned economies, Soviet Union, Japan, now China, races in technology, fears about jobs, usually wrapped in some cloak of national security, as you heard this morning, and certainly encouraged by a host of political interests who want protection, subsidies, and other advantages. So we can learn something from this experience. So we could go back to the 19th century, but since time is limited, I'll just do the 20th. In the 20th century, FDR remains the progressive paragon. If you go back and look at the history of the first New Deal, they were really just trying to try anything to revive confidence. And FDR took some very important steps to restore the banking system and credit. The National Recovery Act, however, which are often referred to as the first New Deal, had a somewhat crazy idea in the Depression about limiting production, creating cartels to boost prices. These turned out not to be very good ideas. Larry can check me, but I think most scholars have concluded that the big mistakes were on the side of monetary policy, exacerbated by trade barriers. And the recovery really relied on the Keynesian stimulus, especially with war production. But the New Deal left a legacy about the potential of government plans, especially among smart people like those attending Harvard and similar universities here, who suspect that they can steer the market economy better than the market. As World War II drew to a close, the planners had designs because they were worried things were going to go back to the 1930s and a large-scale unemployment. But it turned out that pent-up consumer demand came to the rescue. However, one development in that period is worth paying close attention to, which was a man named Vannevar Bush, who helpfully planted the seeds for what became known as the triple helix of American science policy, involving government R&D funding with university research and private sector applications. And that's an interesting point to remember, because that's obviously a hot issue today. It turned out that the Keynesian fine-tuning was not as precise as planned, especially when it came time to fiscal policies and dealing with inflation. Now, this brings me up to my own experience. When I came of professional age, which was in the mid-late 1970s, industrial policy was a hot topic right here at the Kennedy School. Japan and West Germany look like the winners. Ezra Vogel wrote a book explaining why Japan was #1. Names from the past, but worth recalling. Les Thoreau of MIT, Robert Reich became the pamphleteers of a new economic order. Fortunately, President Carter listened to somebody else from Harvard, Stephen Breyer, who chose a different path: deregulation of industries, support of Volcker's Fed policies to break inflation, defense spending and modernization. And Ronald Reagan, although from a very different perspective, continued the tight money, added a fiscal stimulus. By the way, this is Larry Summers' first government job, was working on the CEA under Ronald Reagan. So that's the source of all the contention here. More deregulation and broad-based tax reform. In Reagan's second term, the G7 considered an overvalued dollar, another topic you hear discussed today, and the administration launched a trade agenda. First, the Canada FTA, that becomes NAFTA under Bush 41 and the Uruguay round of GATT. But just as important as the government policies, the US private sector led in innovation in information technology. So I was back at the State Department in 2001, 89, 92 with Secretary Baker, and the clear story here was that the Soviet Union couldn't keep up with American information technology. And it was relying heavily on commodities and oil production, and oil prices fell, which forced Gorbachev to explore a new sort of process. Bush 41, Clinton, and the Republican Congress restored budget discipline, principally with spending caps, but they also kept opening markets. But the enlargement of the world market economy, after all, this was from about 1 billion to 5 to 6 billion people in the blink of an eye, was bound to be disruptive, and it was. This was the era of great moderation in prices, but also the rise of the anti-globalization movement in the late 90s on the progressive left, and protectionism. President Bush 43 managed a recovery from the shock of 9/11, the economic opening. The country gained another huge private sector transformation, this time in the energy sector. When Larry and I used to deal with these issues, we thought the US had a permanent current account deficit from energy. Go look at the numbers today. It's changed. All because, frankly, people took an existing technology with an entrepreneurial spirit and made something happen that none of us at government or the Kennedy School could have foretold. But there was a housing finance bubble, a big crash, requiring extraordinary monetary policies, which were repeated again during the pandemic. And frankly, I think that is going to be an important issue going forward as much as some of these others. Progressives, interestingly, criticized President Obama for a slow recovery, and they sought to remedy it with President Biden, some of the people that you've had a chance to hear from. China's competition and security threat grew. President Xi Jinping turned away from Deng Xiaoping's cautions, and then Trump turned to a haphazard trade protection in his first term. Interestingly, for the first time in 80 years, you now had two presidents, different parties, Trump and Biden, that embraced trade protectionism. President Biden decided he could go further. He could have a second New Deal, which is why I started with the 30s. And in part of this was the idea of the need for the US to reindustrialize in various sectors. As somebody who was on the center right, this gave me endless source of amusement because there was a big battle politically between the people on the Biden side attacking the old neoliberals like Larry Summers here from the President Clinton administration, and Obama being sort of a transitional figure. So once again, I rose to Larry's defense on these topics, which brings me now to the new age of industrial policy. So before turning to a few specifics, I just want to offer three general cautions. One, which I didn't hear mentioned in any of the panels this morning, but I did have to step out a little bit, is that spending matters. The US federal debt is almost 100% of GDP. That's near the post-war high of 106% in 1946. So as all of you consider billions more for one favorite industry or another, what we used to call corporate welfare, so I'm quite intrigued to hear this coming from Harvard, give a thought. Might you rather spend this money on alternative social policies, or maybe even sort of reducing some of the debt? Because I think one of the most important economic, if not industrial policies, is the resilience of America to respond to crisis we can never predict. And that is very much dependent on the credit of the United States. I think that would be an important economic policy, if not industrial policy. Second, the reindustrialization mantra is a nostalgic search for the past. I bet if we had time to poll you, not many of you would recognize that the United States manufacturing output exceeds that of Germany, Japan, South Korea, and India combined. It's only below China, which frankly still operates most of that manufacturing at a lower end. From 2002 to 21, US manufacturing exports more than doubled. Now, of course, as productivity rose, employment came down. And that's true for all economies. If you look at Germany, a manufacturing powerhouse, Australia, or others. And now we have a transition to services, which, by the way, the average wages in services now are probably slightly above that in manufacturing, certainly in many sections. And this is a reflection of consumer preferences. It's that market thing again. People can only buy so much stuff. If you go out and you look at all the businesses around here, hospitals, education, various types of financial services, that's what consumers want to have. And by the way, what is the borderline between manufacturing and service? George Shultz once had a great idea. He said, we should have treated software as manufacturing. Because if you look at the value of a car, probably over 50% is its software, not the metal, okay? So in some of the debate that I've heard from both Biden and Trump over the years, it seems that manufacturing requires bending metal. I heard somebody actually mention that in one of the earlier panels. Let me give you another historical economic analogy. In 1900, 40% of Americans were involved in agriculture. Today, it's about 1 to 2%. From 1948 to 2017, agricultural hours worked in the United States dropped 80%. Output tripled. You're going to see a same process here with manufacturing. And so the effort to try to restore the old industries of the past, in my view, will actually disadvantage the United States for the future. Third, if you still want to try industrial policy, and these are some of the points, at least I took away from some of the first sessions, discipline your objectives and add feedback loops. You heard this kind of on the edge of the discussion. There's always going to be a temptation to blur goals to get more political support. It's built into the system. You can come up with all the expert models you want. In an American political process, you have to accept that's going to be part of the system. I've been around for a while, so I've heard every sector claim national security. One of my favorites was moleskin, because they figured soldiers would need this to protect their feet when they march. The creativity of American industry is endless, including to get public support. The next point, however, is if you decide you're still going to subsidize something for whatever reason, please don't add trade protection. That's an especially dangerous combination, because it reduces the competition, as you heard, I think, in Brian talk about. Now, a word on the two big cases, and I'll just be brief on this since others have spoken, semiconductors and green tech. So for semiconductors, what's the real objective? One might be to limit China, in which case the United States and its allies have advantages with design, software, tools. They offer opportunities across the value chain, if that's your objective. But again, my caution is don't expect these controls are going to last very long, because economic history suggests that people will work around them, as you've seen with DeepSeek and AI and all sorts of industries. So calculate, is it worth a couple of years? And by the way, you'll reduce your sales to those companies, to those markets. Now, another objective might be to reduce dependence on Taiwan. And that, I think, is a real one. It's certainly one that I would be sympathetic to. But in doing so, start out with the economic recognition. There's a good reason that U.S. businesses moved away from capital-intensive, low-margin businesses such as the fab industry. One question you might want to ask is, could we rely on supplies from allies, such as Japan, Germany, and South Korea? Do we have to produce all this ourselves? If they want to subsidize some of it, maybe we can get some of the benefits. And if we must produce which chips? Is our aim an absolute amount? Is it a market share? Is it self-sufficiency? It seems our experience so far, and you've got others here that know the exact numbers, has increased the percentage a little bit, and it certainly hasn't hit what I think was the target sort of mentioned today of about 30%. Now, if you work through all those steps, and I accept that you might want to do this with semiconductors, what about just focusing on TMSC? Recognize TMSC had its own objectives with diversification. It needs land, it needs electricity, it needs the alternatives in case something happens with Taiwan, it needs engineering talent. And if you haven't noticed, Taiwan depends somewhat on the US for its security. It strikes me that there was a deal to be made here in terms of TMSC's interests and the US interest in having prediction here. I went and asked one of the board directors of TMSC, so how important were these subsidies that you heard about, whether $4 or $5 billion? In my world, that used to be real money. And they said, look, it doesn't really matter. What matters is the science part of the CHIPS and Science Act, which I think actually has been underfunded. So remember that science part goes back to Vannevar Bush, that tradition of using the US government to serve overall research funding. In contrast, why waste $10 billion plus on Intel, especially as it now invites a new overreach of presidential power, which I'll come back to. Further, we've combined subsidies with tariff barriers on semiconductor imports. You've heard kind of the question about objective overreach, unionization, childcare, job requirements. My point is, these are going to be inevitable when you pour out these sums of money. So just have to build in the expectation it's going to affect your performance. And by the way, once we subsidize companies, do you think we're going to allow them to export to China? So that brings us right back to the issue of, is this a strategy of export controls or is it sort of domestic production? Having said all this, I had a chance to talk with Michael Schmidt before. I heard him today. If the government had to assign this job to somebody, Michael, I think, and his team did as best as could be expected, but I'm cautioning you for the next time that somebody decides they want to have one of these. A word too on green tech industrial policies. Again, going back to Vannevar Bush, I certainly favor scientific research, perhaps experiments with production methods. And a topic that came up a little bit in the first panel that I would suggest to refer to is now and then countries have used contests to encourage this, and they've used advanced purchase commitments. So one of the greatest industrial policies was the COVID vaccine, which was basically done because of an advanced purchase commitment. That allows more competition, but it allows companies, you heard this also in the defense industry, to have sort of a longer term planning. That's certainly a respectable policy. Expensive use of tax credits. I don't know, you want to subsidize Musk and Tesla? I don't know, it wasn't first on my list. Now, if you also go back and you look at the tax credits, Larry and I were talking about this. The numbers, at least until this administration, of those tax credits were just exploding. And so again, it wasn't just 50 billion. We were up to 60, 100, 150, 250 billion dollars. Again, you have to ask yourself, could that money be used somewhere else, or might we want to pay down the debt in some combination? And then again, the combination with protectionism. Look, let's be fair to China. Everybody wants to organize everything about China. Let's just understand a little bit from the other guy's perspective. I'm a diplomat. I did lots of negotiations, okay? I unified Germany at the end of World War II, or at the end of the Cold War. And we were quite successful in those negotiations. I worked for James Baker, a very tough guy. It was normally useful to understand how the other guy was thinking. We urged China to invest in climate technology. So they did in a big way. I understand the subsidies. And by the way, have you ever looked at American agricultural subsidies and some of the other things that we do? Okay. And I agree it's not ideal. But as someone who actually has worked on the climate issue over 20 or 30 years, I negotiated the first climate treaty, the only one that ever got ratified. I say to myself, why can't I bring in cheap Chinese solar panels? I've asked people across the security community, okay, it's a worst case situation. We're at war with China. Do we really need to produce our own solar panels if we go to war with China? Nobody yet has given me an answer on this, okay? I went to the BYD plant earlier this year. It's a hell of a car. where does the US government get off on saying that I can't buy one of those? Okay, so I've heard the story that they may intercept my conversations with my wife. Okay, fine, let me take the risk. Or they may know where I'm moving. Frankly, they got all the, the security top secret information long ago. They know whatever they need to know. Why is it that I can't buy one of those cars? So as to subsidize Tesla or somebody else? So why should I be doing this? Okay. And then, by the way, if we're concerned about energy, why did Biden limit LNG, which is a vital transition fuel? And if you're thinking about climate in a serious way, as I had to do at the World Bank, India does a lot of coal. I'd like India to move from coal. I'd like it to move to LNG, which is a good transition fuel. So where did our green industrial policy go on blocking American development of LNG? And here's a radical idea. Why not invite a Chinese battery company to produce here? So we can get the tech and the know-how. This is an issue right now going on in Europe because the question of the nature of that. The Chinese did it to us. Fine. If you want to sort of play the game, bring a Chinese battery manufacturer here and we'll learn more about it. So beyond the benefit cost analysis of industrial policies, I want to bring one other item that I haven't heard mentioned today, and it's shocking for me. I'm coming from Washington, where we have this guy called Trump that reads news every day. I would have thought Cambridge would have been somewhat concerned about executive power and the overreach of the presidency, okay? So recall, for those of you studying any economic history, the intellectual origins of neoliberalism in the 1930s was about fear of state power. Because of the 1930s. It was a justifiable concern. The Bidenites should have been alert to this danger, which Trump has certainly heightened. Okay, now the US government lends to Intel, now we own a part of Intel, and guess what comes next? Trump is going to encourage some company to buy from Intel so we can get the customer that you heard is needed, okay? Is that such a good economic policy? I'd rather let companies decide themselves with their own set of customers, okay? NVIDIA says, okay, we'd still like to export some to China. We'll work out the right amount. So the executive branch, the president says, yeah, we need a kickback. We need money for the export licenses, okay? Biden started using the CFIUS process for much more than national security. At the meetings, some of the people, including from the Justice Department representatives, said, for foreign investors, how many jobs are you going to create in the United States? That's not the role of a national security policy. And as you start to manipulate foreign investment, you start to reduce your foreign investment. And that's, I don't think, a good thing. Every day, you could always find an example if you read the business pages. The pharmaceutical and other companies, they make their deals now in terms of the pricing arrangement. Biden blocked Nippon Steel from investing in US Steel. Somebody still has to explain to me the industrial and security policy logic of that one. And of course, then Trump has done better by then opting for a golden share to determine the future of Japanese investment. Okay, now, we've got these funds, the $550 billion Japanese fund, in theory, the $350 billion Korean fund, and we're going to have the Secretary of Commerce now empowered because all of you guys want another Ministry of National Security is going to create a sovereign fund to determine where US investment goes. And by the way, I was on the Temasek board for 10 years. I understand how sovereign funds really work and how they don't work. Singapore has a little advantage. It runs a surplus. And so that money is being recycled back into investment. When we run a surplus, then let's have the meeting about creating sovereign wealth funds. The president threatens company products and economic commentators. You now got the use of IEPA, International Emergency Economic Powers Act, to use tariffs. This will be before the Supreme Court, as I hope some of you know, sort of later this year. I actually signed an amicus brief against this idea because it really goes against the fundamental authorities of Congress in terms of taxing and tariffs. It goes back to the founding of the country. We've got H-1B visa fees without the use of the Administrative Procedures Act. And I don't mean to shock you. We have a colleague here from Indonesia, but all these industrial policies create huge opportunities for corruption of different types of influence in the system, okay? And in this case, it's not just normal corruption. We're enriching the family and friends. This is shocking stuff. So my point on this is I understand the fine tuning of focusing on objectives for different sectors. I certainly support the sort of scientific issues, but we're in an era now where you've got political prosecutions, you've got an attack on the Federal Reserve's sort of independence, attack on the intelligence and the military. Now, of course, you might argue your industrial policies were limited. But please understand, when you enhance the executive power of the presidency over and over and over again, this is what's going to happen in the system. And it's a very dangerous thing for the system. So I'm all for economic efficiency. I'm all for economic advancements. I have this little thing called liberty that is also kind of important in the American political system. So to close with a constructive approach, consider this list of economic versus industrial policies drawn from that historical experience I mentioned. Sound macro policies, broad-based tax system like the reform of 1986, support for science and basic R&D, immigration with secure borders, infrastructure available to all, remove regulatory barriers such as the ones dealing with energy grids and interconnections, competition, including antitrust policies based on consumer welfare, not government friends or foes, reduction of trade barriers, and negotiation for access for services and standards. Trump only focuses on the goods trade. The United States' strength is in the services trade, and we're now no longer doing what trade representatives of both parties did, which is shape the standards for the future to our economic advantage and the system's economic advantage. If appropriate, fine, use stockpiles or advance purchase commitments. So that's probably how I would sort of deal with the minerals issue. But I'd also take a look, by the way, at the permitting and regulatory process that probably killed these industries as much as anything else. So, and policies to help people adjust to change. So if you just take that list, in the American economic political system, that's going to be hard enough to do those things. So be a little careful before we try to extend ourselves to executive authority for smart people to decide how we're going to micromanage sectors of the US economy. By the way, last point, keep in mind, the USSR's economic planners failed. Larry will recall this. His uncle, Paul Samuelson, had a famous textbook. And I think as late as the 1989 version or close to it, he was forecasting the Soviet Union's economy would exceed the United States. I only mention these, A, I like history, but B, I'm trying to, please go back and look. People have tried some of this before. At least if you're going to do it, learn some of the lessons. Japan and Germany, I heard Japan mentioned. Well, oh, Japan, that's a great success story, okay? And I have spent 2 days talking to Germans whining about their economy, okay? So what is interesting about the Biden-Trump approach, and now particularly the Trump approach, was somehow I read these speeches, the United States was in this endless decline and we were suffered terribly by these alliances and so on and so forth. Where do people get this stuff? Our economy was much stronger than Japan or Germany. And frankly, I wouldn't underestimate China, but China's got some very big structural problems as well. So here would be my formula. America's trump card is its openness. Goods, capital, people, ideas, and competition. So please be careful. And if you're going to do this stuff, try to discipline it. Find spending offsets. I didn't hear anybody talk about the spending offsets we're going to have. And consider also in this era of any area, do you really want to be empowering the executive branch further? Maybe we ought to pull back a little bit on that. So.
Well, thank you, Bob, for those comments. We've got some time for questions.
Stirring words.
Stirring words, yes, indeed, stirring words. We do have some time for questions, so I'd like to encourage the audience to please stand by microphone if you'd like to ask one. Perhaps I'll kick off with a question of my own if I can. I think one of the key themes you focused on was the expansive nature of the national security exception in economic policymaking. And I would note that President Trump tweeted last month that tariffs on bathroom vanities would be justified on national security grounds, which I think proves your point that national security has been used in very expansive ways. But I'd like to push you, if I can, on some of the hard cases, setting aside bathroom vanities. And you mentioned in particular the question of solar panels as one. And I think I'm with you insofar as the panels themselves probably don't pose a security risk, but I'm also a bit concerned by what I read in newspapers over the past couple of months from both US and European intelligence services about problems with inverters sourced from China. And so I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that question. And second, on automobiles, if I can. You seem quite happy to allow any sort of audio recordings or video recordings in your car to be intercepted by foreign
I'm not saying I'm
intelligence.
happy. I'm saying, this is a very important point. I'm saying, where is it that the government tells me I can't assume that risk in America?
Okay, well, maybe pose the question this way. It seems to me that if you thought it was okay to ban Huawei from 5G telecoms networks, the same would also apply to autonomous and connected vehicles. So please reflect on that claim, and if you disagree, let us know why.
Well, first off, I wasn't asked the question about whether banning Huawei. I guess I can understand it in telecom networks. I think a network situation is different than a retail product. And frankly, so I think if you're talking about Chinese cyber or spy technology in something that affects all networks and data systems, I'm okay with restrictions or prohibition. I do want to double check to make sure that it's not just being used as a protectionist device. But let me raise this predicate. I spent most of my life in the public sector. Okay, so I know I'm a center-right person. I know, I'm sorry about that, but I understand public policy. Okay, I've been quite active in this. I'm not against public solutions. I'm against the romanticism and spending a lot of money without defined objectives and protectionism and using a national security exception for everything. So you could go through specific cases. As I mentioned, I understand not relying on Taiwan semiconductors. I would have taken a different approach, but I think it's a reasonable effort. And in the green area, in particular, I'm open not only to the idea of the R&D, but I can imagine at some early stage, I would probably use contests, or I'd use some sort of purchase sort of arrangement or some sort of award. I'm not against the role, of the government in the US economy, but I'm offering some cautions. And particularly, there's two that I wanted to add to Larry's. I think he had a threesome list. I'm always a little behind Larry. I only have two. The money does matter, okay? And then secondly, I was just struck, nobody here raised the question that you're talking about giving the president more and more power. Can we figure out some limits on presidential power?
Thank you. Please.
Zoellick, curious as to your views on China's Belt and Road Initiative. Is it a well-timed solution for their resource needs and potentially overcapacity, or is it a credit trap for many nations in the global South?
So, God, this is now dated. It must have been almost 10 years ago. I gave a speech at, I think, at the Global Development Forum, or one of the big Chinese annual conferences. And I said, look, nobody knows the real purpose of this Belt and Road. Okay, is it to use excess capacity? Is it a geopolitical? Is it a developmental? My guess is, and by the way, I'll come back to this point, is that it's some combination of all the above that drove this. In its early stages, when I used to talk to people in the Chinese private sector, they'd say, I'd ask them about their investment in Belt and Road. They said, I want to stay away from that. I want to do business with developed economies. You think I want to go to all those poor countries and lose money there? Okay, so I gave this speech, and the then head of the People's Bank of China I met, and he said, look, we'll give your speech to Xi. And what I said was, look, one way to alleviate some of the concerns is add transparency, add anti-corruption provisions. Frankly, because I do a lot on the animal conservation environmental side, add some things on from the environmental protection. With the countries, add kind of sourcing systems so that they can be part of the sort of development plan. And the next year, she gave a speech that actually mentioned a lot of those things. If I were in US government at the time, I would have then picked up on it and say, okay, you've said these things. How do we now work with you to try to drive this forward, including with Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, who was run by a guy who hired a bunch of former people from the World Bank. Now, this was a different era with China, and I realize you may not sort of be able to do that today. This then gets you into 2 points. One, look, there's a larger question now about the Chinese financing abroad. As you may know, it actually slowed down a couple of years because of the losses. And now we get to this complicated issue of debt restructuring with the IMF and private and governmental creditors. The reason why that's worth mentioning is that even the tone at this conference was kind of, China is the confrontation, okay? Together, we're about 43 to 44% of the world's GDP, okay? I understand the Chinese Communist Party. I first went to China in 1980. I know Xi Jinping. On the other hand, maybe you have to work with them on some things, and maybe there's some sort of mutual interest on some of these topics, which relates to one of the other points. Look, I'm not defending what China has done with some of its industrial policies, which, by the way, I think have wasted a lot of money. But on the other hand, is it so shocking that the Chinese would say, we're going to restrict exports of a mineral that you like when we want to restrict exports of something that they need? And I heard Brian say, oh, well, we wouldn't have done it in the same degree and the same degree. You think they pick that up in Beijing? It looks like we're kind of in a confrontational model, and there'll be some negotiation on this, okay? So part of the point of this, so much of this industrial policy thought, it's been picked up politically. The unions liked it. Brian was telling you, gee, when we put together the bill, we were surprised the Congress wanted money to go here, there, and everywhere. Oh, that's a big surprise. Okay, but on the other hand, you need to recognize some of it's driven by the China fear. And I'm just urging people to be rational and see where we can have some common ground. I use the example of the solar or EVs, okay? Maybe there's something we can do with China that helps deal with the climate issue differently than we've done it before. And so when you think about Chinese policy, or any country's policy, it's useful to understand where are they coming from, okay? Now, we've gone way beyond that because we're going to war with our allies too. So my point of this is that you have to be careful about the national economic policy strands that run through this. So going back to your good question, I'm not against in particular areas, but I'm trying to give a broader caution.
Please.
So Bob,
This should be good.
thank you. Thank you for everything you do to make me look reasonable and to make me look in the center on these issues.
I even defended neoliberalism.
Oh, yeah. I'll defend my late uncle by saying it was the 1960s, not the 1980s, when his textbook said that Russia would surpass the United States. Here's my question, and it's one that I am uncertain of, I'm not certain what the right answer is. Most countries in the world have none, zero, nada domestic automobile industry. Would it be okay, in your view, if sometime in the next 10 years, the United States had no domestic automobile industry because it just wasn't economic, given that there were a variety of other countries that could produce cars better and cheaper than we could?
So let me ask, does domestic industry include US production of Japanese, Korean, and German cars?
Let's assume it does.
Okay. I would like to have a US industry, but if I have to, I can survive with transplants from partners here in the United States.
You'd like to, I tend to buy things I like, but would you pay, would you do anything in order to get what you liked? I mean, how much would you be prepared to do to get what you liked?
As you would expect, Larry, I'd start out by saying, what regulatory costs have I imposed on this industry? And frankly, what unionization and other requirements have I imposed on this industry that make it less competitive? So I would start there, okay? I would look for ways that I could enhance their competitiveness, okay? And look, I'm sure, I mean, what I've described was a contrarian view. Now I'm sure in minority territory. I'm sure there'd be a strong argument for needing to preserve the big three. You raised the question, did it have to be three earlier? Could it have been two? But in terms of kind of where I come down on a principled basis, if you've got production here of companies that frankly, the Japanese, the Germans, the other Korean companies become as US as much as anybody else. You got the plants, you got the jobs, you got the know-how. I'll live with that because I will also be open. If you want to offer some government intervention, okay, I'll listen to it, okay? But my experience has suggested, and certainly the mornings that have suggested, we have many great government tools that don't work and cost a lot of money and that enhance sort of the power of the government over the private sector. So I'm partly forcing a test of reality.
How would you feel, my last in this spirit, but I think it's helpful in understanding your views, and I don't necessarily disagree with you.
Such an odd frame of reference up here in Cambridge, aren't you?
To be concrete, how would you feel if 10 years from now, 15 years from now, the US automobile sales were 40% Chinese vehicles, with 25 of those produced outside the United States and 15 produced in the United States? Would you say kind of good cars, people want to buy them, it's fine? Or would you say it ought to be an important objective of public policy, if possible, to have that not be the outcome?
I would go back to the 1980s experience, okay? And while I'm one of the last free traders left in America, I don't think it was a bad thing that the Japanese and Koreans and Germans invested in the United States auto sectors, okay? And by the way, if you believe in competition, as a few of us still do, it probably forced the US companies to make better cars. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the clunkers that they were building when the Japanese sort of came in. And so first off,
I said 15, so 25 and 50, 40%,
yeah, I mean,
15%, about half of their production here, but their industry
I'm not going to
is
get
40%.
I'd have to, 15, 25, 30. I mean, it's all marginal in economics, right? Okay. So what I would also have some confidence that there'll be somebody in the United States that's got the ability and capability to develop a competitive product. Elon Musk did it, okay? Elon Musk built a new auto car here in the United States. And frankly, one of the reasons I'm resisting your question, this came up, I guess, I missed part of this panel. I think 10 years from now, it's all going to be sort of automatic driving cars. I mean, and on that, I think that we're going to move to a whole different notion of the auto industry. And interestingly enough, again, trying to prevent the old system will probably leave us behind with the new one that's coming forward.
One final question?
So one of the professors.
I hope you don't get in trouble for inviting me, John.
I think it's great. Danny Roderick is a professor here, and he's written about the trilemma, the political trilemma dilemma, right? And you can't have, he says there's democratic decision-making, there's economic integration, and there's national sovereignty, and that you can't have all three, but you may have two. Now, you've advocated, which personally I would agree with, a very strong, very open, competitive system in the United States. If you have foreign companies, China, operating on a very different model, how do you integrate that into your trilemma problem? How do you think about economic integration versus maintaining democratic decision-making, maintaining some degree of national sovereignty, or do you just give some of them up completely?
I'll admit this terrible quality, but Larry will understand it. When you mentioned Danny Roderick, my mind sort of turns off. Because he's become one of the most ardent proponents for protectionism And I still don't quite get why. I mean, he comes from Turkey, a developing country, and he's now taught generations of Americans that we're supposed to, I don't know, protect our various industries, which I think, by the way, is bad for low and moderate income people in the United States, and certainly bad for developing country people. And nobody mentioned those people around here in the course of it. But I will sort of engage on Danny's point this way. I don't understand why you can't have an effective republic with a more limited executive, a Congress asserting its role, a courts playing its role, without subsidizing lots of things and protecting things. We did this quite well from 1934 on as we started to open up our markets, okay? The United States performance in the 20th century was not something that we should be ashamed of, okay? It was quite effective. And by the way, it was quite useful for the rest of the world, okay? So, and the other thing about with sort of the Danny's concept is, I don't know how many of you spend time abroad. There's a lot of fury about the United States out there, okay? We're stopping, you heard somebody from Europe sort of say, well, gee, why should we be your partner when you're screwing us? Seems like a legitimate question. Okay, so what I'm telling you is this industrial policy movement has various strands that go out, including protectionism, including sort of a sense of national self-sufficiency. And so I hate to shock you, but we're living in an interdependent world, okay? And so, yes, there are certain things, we need stockpiles, we need certain critical minerals, fine, okay? And Larry didn't ask me the toughest question, which would probably be the Boeing question. But I do, at the same time, let's recognize that maybe we have to find some modus vivendi with China on some of these things. We do in security terms, okay? Well, maybe we can do it in economic terms too. Why are we having tariffs on Christmas toys and $650 billion of trade? And by the way, there was a question from somebody from the work with the WTO was asking about multilateral systems and subsidies. We have this in agriculture. Okay, by the way, guys, we subsidize a lot of agriculture and have subsidized a lot of agriculture. We tried to develop an international rule system about this. We tried to also do, there's industrial subsidies within the WTO. And yet the former USTR head of the President Council on Foreign Relations says, WTO is dead. Trust me, as somebody who ran one of these multilateral institutions, they're not easy to create. They're very important in the international system for holding pieces together, neutral ground, problem solving. Before you put a stake in it, think about the effects of it, okay? And in the case of, say, the WTO, there's an information technology agreement, there's fisheries subsidies agreement, and a lot of the developing countries rely on this. So look, I'm the ultimate pragmatist. So I wanted free trade agreements in addition to the sort of the WTO round. That could have created a TPP. I'm a big supporter of North American integration. I'm willing to listen to the arguments for government intervention. I'm just trying to put a little caution. And what frankly intrigues me is that I guess people up here think the Biden industrial policy experience works so well. In much of the rest of the country, that's not the general sense. And by the way, there was something called inflation, which seemed to affect the ultimate result of the election, okay? So I'm just cautioning. Let's focus more carefully, and I'll be the right of center person who joins the project on semiconductors from Taiwan or something like that, but don't go whole hog on this stuff.
With that, let me please thank you again for those spirited remarks.